You don't belong at this table." The words landed quietly but cut through the glass-walled conference room like a blade, and for a moment the skyline of downtown Manhattan seemed to freeze behind them, 42 floors above the street where yellow taxis crawled through late-morning traffic and the hum of the city felt miles away from the polished silence inside the boardroom, where 12 executives in tailored suits sat around a walnut table worth more than most people's cars, their eyes fixed on the man in the black hoodie, who had just taken a seat without asking permission. Darius Cole didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't even look up right away. He simply placed a slim leather folder on the table and folded his hands calmly as if he had every right in the world to be there, which only made the discomfort sharper. The man who had spoken, Gregory Whitman, senior partner and known for his sharp tongue, leaned back in his chair with a faint smirk, glancing around as if expecting the others to share the joke, and a few did. Subtle smiles, quiet glances, the kind of silent agreement that travels fast in rooms like this, rooms where status was currency and appearances were everything. "This is a closed executive session," Gregory added, adjusting his cufflinks, his tone polite but heavy with dismissal. "We're expecting decision-makers only." Someone near the far end chuckled softly, another flipped through printed documents, pretending the interruption wasn't worth their attention, but their eyes kept drifting back to Darius, to the hoodie, to the sneakers, to the quiet confidence that didn't match their expectations. Outside the room, an assistant paused while walking past, sensing tension through the glass. Inside, the air felt charged, like the seconds before a storm. Darius finally lifted his eyes, slow and measured, scanning the room. 12 faces, 12 assumptions. He had seen this before, not once, not twice, but enough times to recognize the pattern before it unfolded, the subtle dismissal, the polite exclusion, the quiet disbelief that someone who looked like him belonged in a room like this. He leaned back slightly in his chair, calm, composed, and silent, and that silence unsettled them more than any argument could have. Gregory cleared his throat, now slightly irritated. "Security must have let you in by mistake," he added, tapping the table lightly with his pen, and another executive, a woman in a navy suit, leaned toward her neighbor and whispered something that drew a small laugh. Darius watched it all without reacting, as if he were observing a presentation instead of being the subject of it, and somewhere down the table, a junior analyst named Ethan Parker froze, his eyes widening slightly as he looked at Darius, recognition flickering across his face before uncertainty replaced it. He shifted in his chair but said nothing. Not yet. The silence stretched, the skyline shimmered behind them, and the tension tightened like a drawn wire. Gregory leaned forward again, more direct now. "I'm going to ask you one more time," he said, voice firm but still controlled. "Who invited you?" Darius reached for his folder slowly, deliberately, the movement drawing every eye in the room, and as he opened it, the faint sound of paper sliding against leather seemed louder than it should have been, the kind of quiet detail that made the moment feel cinematic, measured, inevitable. He placed a single document on the table but kept his hand resting on it, not pushing it forward yet, just letting it sit there, waiting, watching, letting the room lean into its own assumptions. And in that moment, no one realized the quiet man in the hoodie wasn't there by mistake. He wasn't lost, and he wasn't about to leave. He was there for something far bigger than any of them expected. The document remained untouched beneath Darius Cole's hand as the room shifted in uneasy silence, and Gregory Whitman leaned forward slightly, his patience thinning, while the faint hum of the air conditioning filled the space between them like a quiet warning. Outside the glass walls a helicopter drifted across the Manhattan skyline, its distant thrum barely audible, but inside the room every sound felt magnified, every glance heavier. Darius finally slid the document forward a few inches, not enough to reach anyone else, just enough to suggest intention. And then he leaned back again, calm, composed, as if the room now belonged to him instead of the other way around. Gregory did not pick up the paper immediately. He glanced instead at the others, searching for confirmation that this interruption still held no weight, but something had shifted. The confidence that filled the room moments earlier had softened into cautious curiosity. The woman in the navy suit tilted her head slightly, and another executive adjusted his glasses, reading the bold header from across the table. Ethan Parker's eyes locked on the document, recognition growing sharper now. His fingers tightened around his pen. He knew that name. He had seen it in quarterly market reports, in acquisition rumors, in quiet industry conversations that rarely reached rooms like this until it was too late. Gregory finally reached forward and lifted the paper, the movement slow, deliberate, like he expected to confirm his assumption in seconds, but the moment his eyes scanned the first line, his expression shifted, just slightly, barely noticeable to anyone except those watching closely, and Darius noticed. He always noticed. Gregory cleared his throat again, though this time the sound felt less certain, less controlled. "I am not sure what this is supposed to be," he said, though he continued reading, his eyes moving faster now, the faint smirk fading into something more measured. Across the table another executive leaned in, trying to catch a glimpse, and the quiet murmur of shifting chairs followed. Darius rested his hands calmly in front of him, his posture relaxed, his expression unreadable, as if he had already seen this moment play out in his mind. Outside the room an assistant walked by again, slower this time, sensing the tension without understanding it. Ethan finally spoke, his voice cautious. "Sir, I think you should read the second page." The words hung in the air, unexpected, and Gregory glanced up sharply, irritation flickering across his face before he looked back down, flipping the page with a faint rustle, and the silence deepened. The skyline shimmered in the reflection of the glass table, and the weight of the moment pressed down quietly. One executive reached for his phone instinctively, another leaned back, eyes narrowing. The shift was subtle but undeniable, and Darius remained still, patient, letting the room catch up to what he already knew, letting the assumptions dissolve on their own, and for the first time since he entered, no one laughed, no one whispered. The confidence that once filled the room had softened into uncertainty, and Gregory lowered the paper slowly, his eyes lifting toward Darius with a new calculation forming behind them, the kind that appears when power begins to move, when certainty fades, and when someone realizes too late that the quietest person in the room may have been the most important one all along. Gregory Whitman placed the document on the table with a measured motion, but the confidence he carried earlier no longer filled the room. His fingers rested on the paper as if weighing its importance, while the other executives leaned forward subtly, drawn in by the shift they could feel but not yet understand. The glass walls reflected their uncertainty back at them, and the skyline behind Darius Cole shimmered in the midday light as though the city itself was holding its breath. Gregory cleared his throat again, slower this time. "Where did you get this?" he asked, though the tone lacked the authority he had used before. Darius did not answer immediately. He simply watched Gregory, calm and steady, allowing the silence to stretch just long enough to change the rhythm of the room. One of the executives at the far end finally spoke, a man named Thomas Bradley who had remained quiet until now. "Gregory, what exactly does it say?" Gregory hesitated, then turned the document slightly so Thomas could see, and the moment Thomas read the header his eyebrows lifted, the movement small but noticeable, and suddenly the room felt different, less controlled, more uncertain. Ethan Parker shifted in his seat again, now clearly recognizing what was happening. He glanced at Darius with growing realization, then back at Gregory, the tension building like a slow rising tide. Another executive leaned forward, trying to read upside down, and the quiet sound of chairs sliding against polished wood filled the air. Gregory finally spoke, though his voice had lowered. "This appears to be a preliminary acquisition offer," he said, and the words landed softly but heavily, like a weight placed carefully in the center of the table. A woman across from him frowned. "From who?" she asked. Gregory glanced back at the first page, then up at Darius again, and this time his eyes held a different calculation. "From Cole Strategic Holdings," he said, and the name settled into the room like a distant thunder, subtle but unmistakable. Ethan exhaled quietly, now fully aware. Thomas leaned back slightly, processing, while another executive reached for his phone, likely searching the name already forming in his thoughts. Darius remained still, composed, his posture unchanged, as though he had already watched this shift happen 100 times before. Gregory leaned forward again, now more cautious. "Are you representing them?" he asked, the question more respectful than before. Darius finally spoke, his voice calm and measured. "I am here to discuss the future of this company," he said, not answering directly, but the effect was immediate. The room grew quieter, the earlier dismissiveness fading into careful attention. Thomas folded his hands, studying Darius now with a different lens. The woman in the navy suit straightened slightly, her skepticism softening into interest. And Ethan felt the moment turning, the assumptions unraveling. Gregory glanced again at the document, flipping to another page, and as he read further his expression tightened briefly, then smoothed again. He placed the paper down slowly, his tone now deliberate. "This is a significant position," he said quietly, and Darius nodded once, not as confirmation, but as acknowledgement of the obvious. The silence returned, heavier now, not from dismissal but from realization. The room that once questioned his presence now studied him carefully, and for the first time since he entered, the executives were no longer wondering why he was there, they were wondering what would happen next. The silence settled deeper across the boardroom as the weight of Cole Strategic Holdings lingered in the air, and Gregory Whitman adjusted his posture, no longer leaning back with casual authority but sitting forward with calculated caution, his eyes studying Darius Cole as if trying to reconcile the calm man in the hoodie with the name now sitting on the table. Thomas Bradley folded his hands slowly, his voice measured when he finally spoke. "If this is a serious acquisition position, we should have been notified in advance." But even as he said it, the certainty behind his words felt thinner than before. Because everyone in the room understood that serious investors did not always announce themselves before entering, Darius remained composed, his gaze steady, the faint reflection of the skyline visible in the polished surface of the table beneath him, and Ethan Parker felt his pulse quicken slightly, the realization now undeniable. He leaned forward carefully. "Cole Strategic Holdings has been increasing positions quietly for months," he said, his voice respectful, almost cautious, and several heads turned toward him. Gregory glanced sharply at Ethan, surprised. "You are certain?" Gregory asked, and Ethan nodded. "Yes sir." Their filing suggested strategic intent, but the timing was unclear. The room absorbed that, the earlier assumptions dissolving further. The woman in the navy suit shifted her chair slightly closer to the table, her expression now thoughtful rather than dismissive. Gregory turned back to Darius. "And what exactly is your role in this?" he asked, his tone controlled but now undeniably respectful. Darius rested his hands calmly on the table, his voice steady when he responded. "I am here to listen first," he said, and the simplicity of the answer unsettled them again, because it suggested confidence without explanation. Thomas leaned forward slightly. "You have already taken a meaningful position," he said quietly, and Darius nodded once, not elaborating. Letting the silence fill the space again, outside the glass walls a cloud drifted slowly across the skyline, dimming the sunlight briefly before it returned, and inside the room the tension tightened in a different way now, no longer dismissive but cautious. Gregory glanced down at the document again, flipping another page, and the faint rustle of paper seemed louder in the quiet. He paused, then looked up. "This level of ownership would give you significant influence," he said, and Darius met his gaze without hesitation. "Influence is earned," he replied calmly, the words landing softly but carrying weight. Thomas leaned back slightly, considering. The woman in the navy suit exchanged a quick glance with another executive, and Ethan watched the shift unfold, the room now adjusting around a new center of gravity. Gregory set the document down carefully, his tone now measured and deliberate. "Then perhaps we should proceed with introductions," he said, the change subtle but unmistakable, and for the first time since Darius entered the room, no one questioned whether he belonged. They were now adjusting to the possibility that he might soon be leading the conversation, and the quiet man in the hoodie remained still, composed, as the balance of power continued to shift in silence. Gregory Whitman nodded slowly as the room prepared to shift into formal introductions, but before he could speak again, a notification buzzed softly across the polished table, then another, then several more, the subtle vibration of phones breaking the silence like distant tremors. Thomas Bradley glanced down first, his expression tightening as he read the message. The woman in the navy suit followed, her eyes narrowing slightly, and Gregory reached for his phone with measured calm, but the moment he unlocked the screen, the confidence in his posture shifted again. The message was brief but unmistakable, a market alert confirming a new controlling stake acquired through Cole Strategic Holdings, time-stamped just moments earlier, and suddenly the air in the room felt different, heavier, more immediate. Ethan Parker looked down at his own device, his breath catching slightly as the numbers confirmed what he had already suspected. The position was not just strategic, it was decisive. Gregory set his phone down slowly, the faint reflection of the screen fading across the table. "It appears your firm has moved faster than expected," he said carefully, and Darius Cole watched him calmly, his expression unchanged. "Timing matters," Darius replied, his voice steady and controlled. Thomas leaned forward, now fully engaged. "This level of acquisition changes the conversation," he said quietly, and the others nodded subtly, the earlier skepticism replaced with cautious respect. Gregory glanced at the document again, then back at Darius. "You planned this," he said, not as an accusation but as recognition. And Darius offered a slight nod, the acknowledgement simple but powerful. Outside, the glass wall's sunlight reflected off neighboring buildings, casting shifting patterns across the table, and inside the room the executives adjusted in their seats, recalibrating their positions in real time. The woman in the navy suit folded her hands. "What is your immediate objective?" she asked, her tone professional, no longer dismissive. Darius paused for a moment, letting the silence hold, then answered calmly. "To understand how this company intends to grow," he said, and the simplicity of the response carried weight. Gregory studied him carefully, then glanced at the others, the unspoken understanding clear. The conversation had shifted from questioning his presence to anticipating his influence. Ethan watched the room transform, the hierarchy subtly rearranging itself, and Gregory leaned forward slightly. "In that case," he said, his tone now measured and respectful, "perhaps we should review our current strategy together." Darius nodded once, calm as ever, and the quiet man in the hoodie remained steady at the center of the table as the room adjusted around him, the earlier assumptions now replaced with cautious respect and growing realization that the balance of power had already begun to change. Gregory Whitman tapped the table lightly as a presentation screen flickered to life at the far end of the room, and the company's growth projections appeared in clean blue charts that stretched across the display, the numbers confident, the tone polished, but the room no longer felt the same as it had 30 minutes earlier. The executives sat straighter now, their attention shifting subtly toward Darius Cole as though his presence alone had altered the stakes. Thomas Bradley began speaking, outlining revenue forecasts and expansion strategies, his voice steady and practiced, yet every few seconds his eyes drifted toward Darius, gauging his reaction. The woman in the navy suit clicked through slides, highlighting projected gains across the next 18 months, and Darius listened quietly, his posture relaxed, hands folded loosely, his expression unreadable, as if he were measuring not just the numbers but the confidence behind them. Ethan Parker watched carefully, noticing how the room seemed to lean toward Darius with each passing minute, the earlier dismissiveness now replaced by careful anticipation. Gregory spoke next, explaining operational efficiency plans, his tone measured, but the certainty that once filled his voice had softened into something more cautious. As the presentation continued, Darius finally leaned forward slightly, the small movement drawing every eye in the room. He studied the screen for a moment, then spoke calmly. "Your growth assumptions rely heavily on market stability," he said, his voice even, and the comment landed with quiet weight. Thomas paused briefly, then nodded. "Yes, that is correct." Darius tilted his head slightly. "And what happens if supply chain volatility increases by 15%? He asked, the question simple but precise. The room stilled. Thomas glanced at the numbers, recalculating silently. The woman in the navy suit exchanged a quick look with Gregory, and Ethan recognized the shift. Darius was not just observing, he was steering. Thomas responded carefully, "We would adjust margins and delay certain expansions." Darius nodded once, then added calmly, "Delay costs momentum." The words were not critical, but they carried authority. Gregory leaned forward, now fully engaged. "What would you suggest?" he asked, and the room grew quieter. Darius paused for a moment, then answered. "Flexibility before expansion," he said, his tone calm but decisive. The executives absorbed the comment, their earlier confidence now evolving into consideration. The presentation resumed, but the rhythm had changed. Each slide now felt like part of a conversation rather than a performance. Ethan watched as the balance continued to shift, the quiet man in the hoodie no longer just an observer but an influence shaping the direction of the room. Gregory glanced again at Darius, then at the others, and for the first time since the meeting began, he adjusted the agenda slightly. "Let us revisit the risk model," he said, and the team complied, the change subtle but meaningful. Outside, the glass walls sunlight reflected off distant buildings, casting moving patterns across the room, and inside the boardroom the transformation continued, the executives no longer leading the discussion alone, the quiet presence at the center now guiding the conversation with calm precision. And as the presentation moved forward, it became clear to everyone at the table that the power in the room had already shifted, not through loud declarations, but through quiet authority that required no introduction. The room settled into a thoughtful quiet after Darius Cole's final comment. the presentation screen still glowing with revised projections as executives exchanged measured glances. Gregory Whitman leaned back slightly, absorbing the shift that had unfolded over the last hour, the sunlight now stretching across the table in long lines as midday edged toward early afternoon, and the air in the boardroom felt different, heavier with consequence. Thomas Bradley cleared his throat and adjusted his notes. "Your perspective suggests a deeper involvement," he said carefully, and Darius nodded once, calm as ever. "That is the intention," he replied, his voice steady, the simplicity of the words drawing every eye toward him again. The woman in the navy suit leaned forward, curiosity replacing her earlier skepticism. "You have already taken a controlling position," she said quietly. And Darius met her gaze without hesitation. "Yes," he answered, and the confirmation settled into the room like a final piece falling into place. Gregory folded his hands slowly, studying Darius with a new level of respect. "Then perhaps it is time we formalize this discussion," he said, and Darius reached calmly for the leather folder in front of him, the movement deliberate, measured. He opened it and removed a second document, thicker than the first, and placed it at the center of the table. The sound of paper sliding across polished wood felt louder than expected, and the executives leaned in instinctively. Gregory reached forward and lifted the document, his eyes scanning the header, and the moment he read the title his posture stiffened slightly. Thomas leaned closer, reading over Gregory's shoulder, and the woman in the navy suit shifted her chair, the tension returning but in a different form. Now, Gregory lowered the document slowly, his voice quieter than before. "This is a full acquisition agreement," he said, and the words settled heavily across the room. Darius remained composed, his expression calm. "It is effective immediately," he added, and several executives glanced at their phones again as new notifications appeared, the faint vibrations echoing across the table. Thomas checked his screen, his eyebrows lifting as the confirmation appeared. The numbers aligned with the document, the ownership structure updated in real time. Gregory exhaled slowly, the shift undeniable now. Ethan Parker watched the transformation unfold, the earlier assumptions dissolving completely. Gregory looked up at Darius, no longer dismissive, no longer uncertain. "You came prepared," he said quietly, and Darius gave a slight nod. "Preparation respects time," he replied, and the room absorbed the calm authority in his words. Thomas leaned back, processing the new reality. The woman in the navy suit folded her hands, her expression thoughtful, and Gregory set the document down carefully, the weight of the moment unmistakable. The quiet man in the hoodie now sitting at the center of a company he had just acquired, and the silence that followed was no longer filled with doubt, but with realization that everything in the room had changed. The silence after the confirmation felt heavier than anything that had come before. The executive sat motionless for a moment as the reality settled in, phones still glowing faintly on the polished table. Gregory Whitman leaned back slowly, his expression composed but thoughtful, the earlier authority replaced with careful calculation. Thomas Bradley exhaled quietly and folded his hands. The woman in the navy suit glanced at the updated ownership structure on her screen once more as if confirming it had not changed in the last few seconds, and Darius Cole remained calm at the center of the table, his posture relaxed, his presence steady, as if the shift in power had always been inevitable. Outside the glass walls the skyline shimmered in the afternoon light, but inside the boardroom everything had changed. Gregory finally spoke, his voice measured. "This is a significant transition," he said, and Darius nodded slightly. "Transitions create opportunity," he replied, his tone calm. Thomas leaned forward, adjusting his notes. "What are your immediate priorities?" he asked, and the question carried genuine curiosity now, not skepticism. Darius paused briefly, letting the silence hold, then answered. "Clarity first," he said. The words simple but deliberate. The executives listened closely. Gregory studied him carefully. "Clarity regarding structure?" he asked, and Darius nodded once. "Structure, leadership, and direction," he said, and the woman in the navy suit exchanged a quick glance with Thomas, the implications becoming clearer. Ethan Parker watched quietly, the transformation in the room unmistakable. Gregory rested his hands on the table, his tone respectful. "We are prepared to cooperate," he said, and Darius acknowledged the statement with a calm nod, then leaned forward slightly, the small movement drawing attention once again. "This company has strong fundamentals," he said, his voice steady, "but growth requires alignment." The words landed softly but carried weight. Thomas nodded slowly, considering. The woman in the navy suit adjusted her tablet, already thinking ahead. Gregory glanced around the table, recognizing the shift among his team, and Darius continued calmly, "We will review operations, leadership structure, and long-term strategy," he said, his tone composed. The executives listened carefully, no one interrupting, the earlier dismissal now replaced with focused attention. Gregory leaned back slightly, absorbing the direction. "Understood," he replied, and the quiet authority in the room settled around Darius, the man who had entered unnoticed now guiding the conversation with measured confidence. Outside the glass walls, sunlight moved across neighboring buildings, reflecting softly into the boardroom, and inside the silence that followed felt calm, controlled, and final, the balance of power no longer shifting but settled. The executives adjusting to the new reality as the quiet man in the hoodie sat at the center of the table, now not just part of the meeting, but leading the future of the company. The room settled into a calm, reflective silence as the final direction took shape, the afternoon light now stretching long across the glass walls and polished table, casting quiet shadows that mirrored the transformation that had taken place. Gregory Whitman sat thoughtfully, his earlier confidence replaced by measured respect. Thomas Bradley adjusted his notes slowly, and the woman in the navy suit closed her tablet with deliberate care, as if acknowledging that the meeting had moved beyond planning into something more significant. Darius Cole remained composed at the center of the table, his posture relaxed yet steady, the quiet authority he carried no longer questioned. Ethan Parker watched the room carefully, aware that the moment would be remembered long after the meeting ended. Gregory finally spoke, his tone calm. "We appreciate the clarity you have provided," he said, and Darius nodded slightly, then leaned forward just enough to draw attention without effort, his voice calm and measured when he responded. "I came here to understand how decisions are made," he said, the words simple but deliberate. The executives listened closely. Thomas folded his hands, reflecting. The woman in the navy suit studied Darius with quiet respect, and Gregory acknowledged the shift with a subtle nod. Darius paused briefly, then continued, "Earlier today, I walked into this room quietly," he said, his tone steady, the memory of the opening moments hanging in the air. Several executives exchanged subtle glances, the realization settling deeper. No introduction, no announcement. Darius added calmly, "Just observation." The silence that followed felt heavier, not uncomfortable, but reflective. Gregory lowered his gaze briefly, recognizing the meaning behind the words. Thomas leaned back slightly, absorbing the message, and Darius continued, "Leadership is not defined by appearance," he said, the sentence calm but powerful. The executives listened without interruption, the room now completely still. "It is defined by vision, preparation, and respect for the future," he finished, the words landing softly yet decisively. Gregory nodded slowly, acknowledging the statement. The woman in the navy suit offered a faint respectful smile, and Ethan felt the significance of the moment settle across the room. Darius leaned back slightly, his expression calm. "This company has strong potential," he said, his tone composed, "and together we will move forward." The statement felt less like a promise and more like direction. Gregory straightened slightly. "We are ready to move forward," he replied, and the quiet agreement among the executives followed naturally. The tension that had once filled the room now replaced with calm alignment. Outside the glass walls the skyline stretched endlessly, and inside the boardroom the transformation was complete. Darius Cole rose slowly from his chair, the movement calm and deliberate, and as he gathered his folder the executive stood as well, not out of formality but out of respect. The quiet man in the hoodie who had entered unnoticed now leaving as the owner of the company, and as he walked toward the glass door, he paused briefly, then spoke one final time, his voice calm, measured, and unforgettable. "You judged the hoodie," he said softly. "I judged the future," and with that he stepped out into the quiet hallway, leaving behind a room forever changed by calm authority, preparation, and the power of quiet leadership.